Here we are this morning talking to my very good friend and genuine champion of liberty, Topher Field. Hi, Topher.
Tim, thank you so much for having me.
Well, thanks for joining us here after this chat about the Freedom Day protest tomorrow in Melbourne.
Yes, should be a very interesting day.
Many people would say it's irresponsible to be attending a mass gathering during lockdown. Why do you think the event should be going ahead?
Sure. Look, my relationship with the event is that I heard about it and I heard that it was being organised, and I've decided that I am going to attend. And if I happen to see other people there, that's great. But for reasons that should be fairly obvious to anyone listening to this, I'm not going to go on the record and say, hey, you should come along to this. All I'm saying is I will be there. The reason I think this is vitally important is for two reasons. Number one, the reaction, the laws that have been passed in response to the coronavirus are completely out of proportion to the threat of the virus itself. The damage being done to our parliamentary democracy, the fact that Parliament basically had to fight and break the law just to be able to sit and force the government to at least listen to some questions which I will note they refused to answer, and they dodged relentlessly. But the very fact that our parliamentary democracy is no longer functioning as it was designed, that didn't even happen during World War II. This is not, the coronavirus is not a justification for suspending our democratic rights and suspending the functioning of the parliament that we, the people, have elected. So the response is completely disproportionate. In addition to that, the restrictions are completely disproportionate, shutting down businesses instead of allowing them to operate with, let's say, social distancing and masks and other things, hand sanitizers and so forth in place. Imposing a curfew has no relationship whatsoever to the spread of this virus. It just makes enforcement of the restrictions a little bit easier. Again, it's not proportionate. It's not actually about reducing the risk. It's about simplifying the life of police who are trying to enforce these restrictions. Putting in place a law that says, well, you can't leave your home for 23 hours of the day, effectively turning Victoria into a free-range prison with lockdown borders and the whole lot. This is a draconian response. This is, again, it is completely disproportionate to the risk. Now, I want to be clear. I don't believe there's no risk. There is a virus, and the virus is very serious for older people, and especially for older people who have pre-existing health conditions. But that is, the same can be said for the flu, the same can be said for the common cold, the same can be said for a range of conditions that are far more dangerous for old people and especially for older sick people than they are for younger people. And we've never justified locking down the state before, and this virus simply does not justify doing it now. And I think we need to stand up to the precedent that's being set, which is why I'm going to be attending tomorrow.
I think we've all seen the video online yesterday and today of the police breaking into people's houses, arresting them. It's almost like they're slapping us in the face, rubbing our noses in it that we have no rights anymore.
Yeah, well, they would like us to believe that we have no rights anymore. I've got a bit to say about that, but let me just firstly comment on the arrests themselves. The cack-handedness, the ham-fistedness of how all of this has been handled from the Premier, but also from the police, has just been astonishing. And why or how they thought that they were going to be able to do these things and not generate a massive public backlash boggles my brain. Maybe they meant to create a backlash. I don't know. But it doesn't make sense for them to be out there thinking that they can do this stuff and that there isn't going to be a massive, massive reaction. The fact that the Premier this morning tried to claim, oh no, I haven't seen that footage. I can't comment on the footage of the pregnant woman being arrested. Well, the only way he would have avoided that, because it's been watched now over 8 million times, the only way he would have avoided that, given he has media advisors watching for this stuff and briefing him on this stuff all the time, is if he literally said to them, no, don't show that to me. I want to be able to say that I haven't seen it. He would have to have actively avoided seeing it. That's the only way that he'd be able to say that. He thinks we're fools. He's playing us for fools. He has also thrown the police under the bus. And if there's any police officers listening, I want you to log this in the back of your brain. The Premier does not have your back. You are carrying out his orders. You're being his foot soldiers. You're doing things that are incredibly unpopular, that are damaging the standing and the reputation of your uniform and the police force that I'm sure you love and you care for, and you want that reputation to be protected going forward. That reputation is being destroyed by the instructions and the orders that are coming down from the top right now from Daniel Andrews. But when the shoe is on the other foot and you need him to fight for you, he runs away like a little girl. He backed off so quickly and claimed that he had never given instruction that people should be arrested on the basis of their Facebook posts. He said that this morning. Now, he's throwing police officers under the bus. He's showing absolutely no loyalty. He's loyal only to himself. He has come in, and I don't believe he even thinks that his own laws are lawful, and I'll talk about that in a second, but he's come in drunk on power, done all kinds of things that I think he knows are just going way too far. He has manipulated the police officers, and he has a very subservient senior police set. The senior police should be absolutely ashamed of how supine they have been and how obedient they have been to what really are very obviously not lawful instructions that they've been given. And yet Daniel Andrews is not repaying the favour. He is not returning the loyalty. He will throw Victoria Police, and has proven that he will throw Victoria Police under the bus the moment the pressure is on. So I would question, if you're a Victoria Police officer, why are you going along with this? If you care about the Victoria Police and their reputation, why are you going along with this? Now, there's a couple of points I really want to make about the arrests in particular. There is a well, it comes directly from the Honourable Murray Gleeson, ACQC, who's a former Chief Justice of the High Court of Australia. He was 10 years in the job from 1998 to 2008. And I want to take a fairly large quote from him, because I don't want to be accused of misrepresenting what he has said. But he's talking about how important it is to not abuse the power of arrest. If you have the option of issuing a summons or doing something that is less invasive, less violating than arresting somebody, that you have a responsibility to do that instead. So here's the quote. The power of arrest is a power that is given for the purpose of taking into custody suspected wrongdoers in circumstances where such custody is necessary for the proper administration of justice. It is not a power that is to be exercised punitively. The police are not given a power to arrest suspected offenders for the purpose of enabling the police to punish such people, and the exercise of a power of arrest for such a purpose would be a serious abuse of power. That comes directly from the Honourable Murray Gleeson, and I want to continue with a second quote from him. Many criminal proceedings are of a kind that can be commenced either by arrest or by the much less dramatic procedure of the issue of a summons. Where there is no reasonable apprehension that an accused person will fail to turn up to court to answer the charges, excuse me, and where the issue of a summons is an available procedure, it would be quite wrong to use the procedure of arrest or warrant, where the purpose of doing so is to display the law operating with its full severity. I'm going to reread those last two sentences. It would be quite wrong to use the procedure of arrest or warrant where the purpose of doing so is to display the law operating with its full severity. And that is directly from a former Chief Justice of the High Court of Australia. Now, that I think is a damning description and indictment against what we're seeing from Victoria Police right now, where they are choosing to use arrest against people accused of incitement, and I don't believe that charge actually will stand. I'll talk about the legality of the protest and the application of Victorian human rights law in just a moment. But they are accused of inciting people to commit an illegal act. A summons would be just fine. A summons would serve the purpose perfectly well. If they can give them a court date on bailing, then they can give them a summons with a court date on it. Right? That there is no logistical challenge here that stops them from being able to use a summons. I believe it is very clear that they are using arrest in order to create a spectacle, in order to abuse their power and to show the law, to quote the Honourable Murray Gleeson, to show the law operating with its full severity. So I think they are going to get themselves into a lot of trouble because of these arrests.
It's quite clear they're trying to intimidate with it. In Parliament on Tuesday, when we were debating the extension of the emergency powers, the government were really keen to every time someone suggested those powers were dictatorial, they were saying you're all conspiracy theorists. The government wouldn't abuse the power. And then we wake up to see these videos of people being arrested in their houses for posting things on Facebook.
Exactly. Their defense is, oh, we wouldn't do that. And the answer is, you already are.
Yeah. Do you think that the protest on Saturday is actually illegal?
No, I don't. There's two common misconceptions with how people read the interaction between the emergency declaration and Victorian human rights law. And I want to dispel both of them right from the outset. Some people think because there's an emergency declaration that overrides everything else, that whatever the emergency declaration says goes. And I have relatives who are in the police force and friends who are in the police force, and that tends to be how they default. When you challenge the legality of things, they say, oh, but I've read the legislation, I read the emergency declaration, it gives me the power to do all of these things. And they assume that therefore means that no other law applies anymore. At the other end of the spectrum, you've got some people who don't know the law necessarily very well, but they're very passionate about their rights. And they say, well, we have the Charter of Human Rights and Responsibilities in Victoria, and that says this, this, and this. It says I can freely assemble. It says I can go about my business. And that therefore overrides everything else. Well, I'm sorry, you're both wrong. Now, let me be clear here. The rights should trump everything else. I'm of the opinion that our rights are inalienable and that there are no circumstances under which a government ought to have the power to take them away. But unfortunately, that's not the reality in Victorian law right now. In Victorian law, the Human Rights Charter. So if I can quote from humanrights.vic.gov.au under section 7.2 of the Charter, it says this: rights may be limited in certain circumstances, but it must be reasonable, necessary, justified, and proportionate. Now, that's not the actual legislation itself. That's the government's human rights website describing the legislation. But these are the words that it uses. The limitation on our rights must be reasonable, necessary, justified, and proportionate. And it has to be all four of those things. If it fails on any one of those, it is no longer law, and the human rights law actually stands unreduced, unaffected by whatever law has been written. I want to add to that, reading from the legislation itself, under the Human Rights Charter, 7.2.e, any reduction in these rights must take into account, quote, any less restrictive means reasonably available to achieve the purpose that the limitation seeks to achieve. So now there are 5 thresholds that any reduction to our human rights under the Victorian Human Rights Charter of Human Rights and Responsibilities, there are 5 thresholds that must be met before that stands. It must be reasonable, necessary, justified, proportionate, and the minimum level of restriction necessary to achieve whatever it is that that limitation was intended to achieve. The government do not believe that they have successfully achieved this. The government have no faith in the lawfulness of their own emergency declaration. I can demonstrate that because they have not allowed any fines that have been challenged to go to court. Now, this has been confirmed by Rebecca Falkingham from the Department of Justice and Community Safety, and she admits that no fines have been allowed to get to court. She says, quote, the fact are, most are resolved when they go to the review stage, end quote. Now, by resolved, she means withdrawn, and by most, she means every single one of them so far. Now, this isn't just me saying that the Human Rights Charter actually still applies. This is actually directly from the Victorian Attorney General, Jill Hennessy, when she was questioned by David Lindbergh, MLC, your colleague, Tim, and a member for the Liberal Democrats. And both of you have been doing wonderful work. When Jill Hennessy was questioned by him, she said, and I quote, what remains is the ability for people to be able to enforce and argue those rights. She's talking about the rights in the Charter. None of those rights have been suspended in terms of people's capability to go and enforce those in a court of law. So we know that they are still in force. We know that we can still argue them in a court of law. And the Human Rights Charter is very clear about the circumstances under which they can be limited. And I don't believe, and I don't think the government believes, that they have met those limits. They are not withdrawing these fines out of the kindness of their heart. They're not doing it because they just want to do a gesture of goodwill. We can see very clearly from the arrests and everything else, they have no goodwill towards the people that are speaking up against the government. They have no faith that these fines will stand up in court. Now, will the charges of incitement stand up in court? Well, that's a slightly different question. And it depends really on how defense runs the case. If the defense can make it all about whether or not the outlawing of protests was legal in the first place, then I think they're going to run a very good case on the basis that it was a breach of the Charter of Human Rights. I think it's very unlikely that the government would allow a judgment to be handed down if they ran the case like that. I think they would withdraw the charges rather than risk a ruling that basically says that everything they did was illegal. Because if outlawing the protests is illegal, it is going to follow very quickly from there that much of the other contents of that legislation was illegal. Therefore, all of the economic harm, the suffering, the depression, the suicides, the heavy-handed and intimidating police tactics were all unlawful. And you can only imagine the court cases that are going to come out of the other end of that. So no, it isn't as simple as one or the other wins, but I believe that if run through a court of law, it would be found that the restriction stopping us from exercising what is one of our most fundamental political rights in a liberal democracy, and that is the right to assemble and protest and express our political opinion to the government. The implied right of political communication has been found to exist by the High Court of Australia. There's multiple precedents, and each of those precedents tends to expand that right rather than narrow it. We have the right to protest. The police are going to operate as if we don't. The unfortunate reality is they're following orders from their absolutely cowardly senior ranks, who are simply following the instructions of the government, and the government, I think, are absolutely running scared. They are terrified. I would liken it to the emperor having no clothes. I think Daniel Andrews is approaching the point where he is realizing as the emperor that he has no clothes, that the powers that he gave himself won't actually hold up in court. And he's now at the point where he has to continue the parade, stark naked in front of us all, continuing to pretend like he's done the right thing and continuing to pretend like we're all the ones who are wrong. And I think we're right at that tipping point. And he's about to find himself embarrassed and disgraced.
I couldn't agree more. I think the government have been they've been in a bubble of their advisors and health bureaucrats and everybody telling them what a wonderful job and necessary job they're doing, and they have just been completely unaware of the building anger and tension in the community, and it's just about to go bang. You could see it in Parliament last week.
I certainly hope that the protests tomorrow around Australia, because it's not just in Melbourne, are peaceful. I do not want to see anyone who is against the government's actions engaging in any kind of violence and any kind of escalation. The unfortunate reality is, and we can see it in the way police have behaved towards the people that have exercised their right to protest in Dandenong and in Broadmeadows recently around Melbourne, that they are very willing to escalate. They are very willing to go from a level 3 of people verbaling each other to a level 10 of 5 of them piling in and making quite a forceful arrest. And they're willing to do that on the drop of a hat. So unfortunately, I think it is very likely that we are going to see some abuses. I think some people are likely to get injured, but my plea to everyone who is coming to join the protest against the government is don't let that be on account of your own actions. Don't escalate. Don't be the one that starts or even joins anything. Let's just not allow the government to use that as cover for to claim that we are a violent mob or that we're just a bunch of conspiracy theorists or the various labels. And here's another thing: how the gall of senior public servants coming out and labeling anyone that doesn't agree with the government's position on this as a conspiracy theorist, as a nut job. They are playing politics. They have ceased to be the impartial enforcers of the law, and they have become highly partisan, highly political, and this is damaging, I dare say, destroying the reputation and the standing of Victoria Police amongst the community, and it is going to take decades for that reputation to recover if it ever does.
I think we're doing terrible damage to the fabric of our society with this lockdown. The reverberations are going to be echoing for decades to come, really. All right, yes. My chainsaw started up next to me again. We might wrap it up there.
All right.
I look forward to talking to you again in the future, Topher.
Look, thank you so much. And thank you for everything that you're doing. Please pass my thanks on to David for everything that he's doing and wonderful work the Liberal Democrats are doing in Victoria in these really, really extraordinary times.
Thank you very much.